Boston, 1962, a city built on history, was about to be defined by horror. For 2 years, the women of Boston lived in a state of paralyzing fear. Between June 1962 and January 1964, 13 women were murdered, not in dark alleys, not in abandoned buildings, in their own homes. The killer left no forced entry, no fingerprints, no witnesses, only bodies. He strangled them with their own stockings, their own scarves, their own belts, and then he disappeared into the city, as if he'd never been there at all. His name became legend, the Boston Strangler, and in 1965, a man confessed. His name was Albert DeSalvo. But what if he wasn't actually the killer? June 14, 1962, a Thursday morning in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. The kind of morning where nothing bad is supposed to happen. At 77 Gainsborough Street, neighbors began to worry. Anna Sleezers, a 55-year-old Latvian immigrant, hadn't been seen in over a day. Her son was supposed to pick her up for a concert. She never answered the door. When her son finally entered the apartment, he found his mother on the bathroom floor. She'd been strangled with her own bathrobe belt. But here's what made detectives stop cold. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks, which meant one of two things. Either Anna Sleezers knew her killer, or she let him in willingly. And then there was the staging. Her body had been arranged, posed, as if the killer wanted to send a message. Police initially assumed it was an isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong, a personal vendetta. They were wrong. 2 weeks later, Nina Nichols, 68 years old, was found strangled in her apartment. Same method, same staging, no forced entry. And just 2 days after that, Helen Blake, 65, was discovered in her home. She'd been dead for days. 3 elderly women, all living alone, all strangled with items from their own homes, stockings, belts, scarves, and all of them had let their killer inside. The media seized on the story, and a name was born, the Boston Strangler. By the end of summer 1962, the body count had risen to 6, all women over 60, all killed in the same suffocating, intimate way. Boston was no longer just a city. It was a hunting ground, and the hunter was invisible. Within weeks, Boston transformed. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Women who had lived independently for decades suddenly couldn't sleep alone. Daughters brought their mothers home. Sons moved back in with their elderly parents. Those who stayed alone stopped answering the door, stopped trusting delivery men, stopped believing they were safe. The Boston Police Department was under siege, not from the killer, but from the public. Hundreds of tips flooded in daily. Suspicious neighbors, strange men in hallways. Every plumber, every repairman, every stranger became a suspect. Detective John Donovan led the task force, a 20-year veteran, a man who'd seen the worst Boston had to offer. But this was different. This was personal, because the Strangler wasn't just terrorizing the city. He was terrorizing every family, every son, every daughter, every person who loved someone vulnerable. And despite the manhunt, despite the manpower, the media attention, the public pressure, the killer remained a ghost. Then, in December, everything changed. Sophie Clark, 20 years old, a graduate student, beautiful, independent, her whole life ahead of her, strangled in her apartment. The same signature, the same method. But Sophie Clark wasn't elderly. She didn't fit the profile. And just like that, the rules were gone. If the Strangler could kill a 20-year-old, he could kill anyone. Boston was no longer just afraid. Boston was paralyzed. And somewhere in that city, the Strangler was still hunting. By early 1963, the Boston Strangler investigation had become the largest manhunt in the city's history. A multi-jurisdictional task force was formed. Detectives from Boston, Cambridge, Lynn, Lawrence, all working under one roof. Leading them, Detective John Donovan. Donovan was old school, 30 years on the force, seen everything, solved cases that seemed impossible. But this This was different, because somewhere in Boston, his own mother was living alone, locking her doors, jumping at every sound. For Donovan, this wasn't just a case. It was every nightmare a son could have. In a groundbreaking move for the 1960s, the task force brought in a criminal psychologist, Dr. James Brussel. Brussel built a profile. The killer was likely white, between 25 and 40 years old, average build, unremarkable appearance, someone who could blend in, someone who looked safe. It was revolutionary, and it narrowed the field from thousands to hundreds. But hundreds of suspects was still too many. Every day, new leads poured in. Every day, detectives chased shadows. They analyzed routes, timelines, victim similarities. But the more they looked, the less sense it made. The media was relentless. The public furious. Politicians threatened to replace the entire police leadership. Careers were on the line. But for Donovan, it wasn't about politics. It was about the women. 7 women dead, and counting. As the investigation dragged on, the Strangler kept killing. But something was changing. The pattern was breaking. At first, the victims were all elderly women. Now, they ranged from 19 to 85. Different neighborhoods, different economic backgrounds, different lifestyles. The strangling method remained consistent. Stockings, scarves, belts. But the signatures varied. Some victims were sexually assaulted. Others weren't touched at all. Some scenes were meticulous, almost ritualistic. Others were chaotic, frenzied. It was the question no one wanted to ask. What if the Boston Strangler wasn't one man? What if it was 2, 3? It would explain everything. The age range, the scattered locations, the varying methods. But it also meant something terrifying. The city wasn't being hunted by one monster. It was being hunted by several, and they were all hiding in plain sight. January 4th, 1964, the coldest day of the year, and the day Boston's nightmare reached its peak. Mary Sullivan, 19 years old. She'd moved to Boston just days earlier to start a new job. Her roommates found her in her bedroom, strangled. But this scene was different. This wasn't just murder. This was a message. The level of brutality, the staging, the sheer rage. Even hardened detectives couldn't stomach what they saw. This wasn't the work of someone trying to hide. This was the work of someone who wanted to be seen. The media frenzy reached fever pitch. Thousands took to the streets, demanding arrests, demanding protection, demanding an end to the terror. But behind closed doors, panic was setting in. 13 months, 13 victims, and still no arrests. The Strangler had escalated, grown bolder, more violent. The city braced for the next attack, prepared for number 14. But then, the murders stopped. No new victims, no new crime scenes, just silence. Weeks turned into months. Months of waiting for the phone to ring, for another body to be discovered. Slowly, cautiously, Boston began to breathe again. Theories swirled. Had the Strangler died? Moved to another city? Been arrested for something else? Or was he just waiting? The answers would come from the most unlikely place. A prison cell, a confession, and a man who would become famous for all the wrong reasons. October 27th, 1964. 10 months after Mary Sullivan's murder. 10 months of silence. A man was arrested in Cambridge, not for murder, for breaking and entering. His name was Albert DeSalvo, 33 years old, married, 2 children, a maintenance man from Chelsea. He lived a quiet life, worked steady hours, came home to his wife and kids every night. But Albert DeSalvo had a secret. For years, he'd been breaking into women's apartments under a very specific disguise. He called himself a talent scout, told women he was looking for models, asked to take their measurements. And once inside, he would touch them, assault them. The press called him the measuring man. Dozens of victims, years of assaults. But that wasn't all. Under another identity, DeSalvo had broken into hundreds of homes, tied women up, sexually assaulted them. They called him the Green Man because witnesses described him wearing green work clothes. His crime spanned 4 states. Hundreds of victims. A serial predator operating for nearly a decade. But here's what was strange. Albert DeSalvo wasn't violent in the traditional sense. He tied women up, yes. He assaulted them, yes. But he never seriously hurt them, never used excessive force. And he never killed anyone. Psychologically, he didn't fit the profile of a murderer. The measuring man was a predator. The Green Man was a rapist. But neither was a killer. DeSalvo was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, a secure facility where the state kept its most dangerous minds. And it was here, in a maximum security mental hospital, that the Boston Strangler case would finally break wide open. Bridgewater State Hospital wasn't a normal prison. It housed the criminally insane, men who committed unspeakable acts, men society had locked away and forgotten. When DeSalvo arrived, he was placed in a cell with another inmate. His name was George Nassar. Nassar was no ordinary criminal. He was a convicted murderer, killed a gas station attendant in cold blood during a robbery. But what made Nassar dangerous wasn't just his violence. It was his mind. IQ of 157. Genius-level intelligence. A master manipulator. At first, DeSalvo and Nassar were just cellmates. 2 criminals, biding their time. But late at night, when the guards weren't listening, DeSalvo began to talk. He talked about women, about breaking into apartments, about things he'd done, things he claimed he'd done. At first, Nassar thought DeSalvo was just another inmate, bragging, fantasizing. But the details were too specific, too accurate. DeSalvo described crime scenes that had never been made public. Victim details only the killer would know. And George Nassar, genius, manipulator, murderer, realized something. He was sharing a cell with the Boston Strangler. Nassar knew an opportunity when he saw one. He contacted his attorney, a young, ambitious lawyer named F. Lee Bailey. Bailey was already making a name for himself, defending high-profile cases, chasing headlines. And when Nassar told him about DeSalvo's confessions, Bailey saw something even bigger than a case. He saw fame, fortune, the trial of the century. F. Lee Bailey took on Albert DeSalvo as his client. And DeSalvo, the nobody, the maintenance man, the man invisible to the world, finally had someone who wanted to listen. March 6, 1965. F. Lee Bailey called a press conference, and he made an announcement that would shock the nation. Gentlemen of the press, I represent Albert DeSalvo, and my client is the Boston Strangler. The room erupted. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Front page of every newspaper. Top story on every radio station. For the families of the 13 victims, it was supposed to be closure. For the police, it was complicated. DeSalvo began confessing in detail, not just to the 13 known Strangler murders, but to others, crimes that were never connected to the Strangler. He claimed responsibility for attacks across New England, described crime scenes with eerie precision. The details were astounding. Apartment layouts, victim descriptions, items in their homes that were never photographed or reported. Some detectives were convinced. How else could he know these things? But others weren't so sure, because despite all the confessions, despite all the details, there was a problem. No physical evidence. No fingerprints at any crime scene matched DeSalvo. No fibers. No hair samples. It was as if the Strangler had been a ghost. And when surviving victims, women who'd been attacked but escaped, were shown DeSalvo's photo, they didn't recognize him. The prosecutors faced an impossible situation. They had a confession. They had public pressure to convict. They had a suspect in custody. But they had no evidence. No forensics. No witnesses. And in American law, a confession alone isn't enough to convict. F. Lee Bailey knew this. He'd built his entire strategy around it. DeSalvo would confess, get the fame, the attention, the notoriety. Bailey would get the book deals, The movie writes, the career-defining case. And the prosecution? They couldn't prove a thing. So in the end, Albert DeSalvo was never tried for the Boston Strangler murders. He was tried for the Green Man crimes, the assaults, the break-ins, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The Boston Strangler was going to prison, but not for being the Boston Strangler. The public didn't care about the technicalities. They had their monster. Boston could finally breathe. And Albert DeSalvo, he got exactly what he wanted. He was famous. But fame comes with a price. And in the years to come, DeSalvo would learn that some confessions are more dangerous than the truth. Walpole State Prison. Maximum security. Albert DeSalvo was now inmate number W26587, the Boston Strangler, the most famous prisoner in Massachusetts, maybe in the entire country. But while the public celebrated justice, while the media declared victory, Detective John Donovan couldn't let it go. Something didn't sit right. So he did what any good detective would do. He went back to the beginning, and he started checking every detail, every claim, every description. And that's when the cracks began to show. Take Anna Sleezer's, the first victim. DeSalvo said her apartment had a window facing the street. It didn't. Sophie Clark's apartment. DeSalvo described the furniture layout incorrectly. Nina Nichols' bedroom. He got the color of the walls wrong. Small details. Easy to miss in the overwhelming confession. But to a detective who'd walked those crime scenes, these weren't small details. They were red flags. Donovan brought his concerns to the task force, because that was the other problem. The Boston Strangler case had been the biggest media story in years. Details had leaked. Crime scene photos had been published. Every reporter in Boston was digging for information, and some detectives were willing to talk. DeSalvo had access to newspapers. He'd been questioned by dozens of detectives, and during interrogations, case files were sometimes left carelessly visible. But Donovan couldn't let it go, because there was one more thing that didn't add up. Several women had survived attacks by the Strangler. They'd fought back, escaped, gotten away. When these women were shown DeSalvo's photo, when they stood in lineups with him present, none of them identified him. Not one. The survivors, the only people who'd actually seen the Strangler and lived, didn't recognize Albert DeSalvo. For months, Donovan worked in secret, separating the murders, analyzing patterns, looking for what everyone else had missed. And slowly, a different picture emerged. What if the 13 murders weren't all committed by the same person? Look at the signatures, the staging. Some scenes were meticulous, ritualistic, controlled. Others were frenzied, violent, chaotic. Different levels of control, different motivations, different killers. The elderly victims, killed in similar ways, similar neighborhoods. Possibly one killer. The younger victims, different methods, different signatures. Possibly another. And Mary Sullivan, the most brutal, the most staged, possibly a third. And then there was George Nassar, the genius murderer, the man who shared a cell with DeSalvo, the man who heard the confessions first. Investigators began checking Nassar's timeline, where he was when the murders happened, and the results were disturbing. Nassar couldn't be ruled out for at least 6 of the murders. His psychological profile matched the Strangler better than DeSalvo's. Cold, calculating, controlled. The knots used in some stranglings required specific knowledge. Nassar had military training. He knew how to tie advanced knots. DeSalvo didn't. What if Nassar had fed DeSalvo the details? What if the confession wasn't a confession at all, but a script? And then there was F. Lee Bailey, the lawyer who stood to gain everything. Within months of DeSalvo's confession, Bailey had a book deal, $250,000. Movie rights sold to Hollywood. Hundreds of thousands more. National interviews. Talk show appearances. His law practice exploded. Every celebrity criminal wanted Bailey as their attorney. And DeSalvo, he got what he wanted too. Fame. Notoriety. He went from being nobody, a working-class maintenance man, to being one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Bailey had arranged financial support for DeSalvo's family in exchange for confession. For the rights, for the story, justice had become a business transaction. By 1967, the doubts about DeSalvo's confession had grown too loud to ignore. Victims' families demanded answers. Legal experts questioned the conviction. But there was a problem. DeSalvo's confession had never been used in court because he'd never been tried for the Strangler murders. He'd only been convicted of the Green Man assaults, rape, breaking, and entering, which meant legally the Boston Strangler murders were still unsolved. Officially, the cases remained open. No one had been convicted. No one had been definitively proven guilty. The prosecutors knew they couldn't win a trial. No physical evidence. Questionable confession. Survivors who didn't identify him. It wasn't a confirmation. It wasn't a denial. It was carefully worded ambiguity. And DeSalvo kept playing the part. But in private, he started telling a different story. More inmates heard similar admissions. DeSalvo's story kept changing. Sometimes he was a strangler. Sometimes he wasn't. Psychiatrists noted his desperation for attention, his need to be important, to be famous, to matter. And the Boston Strangler confession gave him all of that. So why would we take it back? By 1973, DeSalvo had spent years in prison. The fame had faded. The interviews stopped. He told the prison chaplain the truth. But by then, no one was listening, because Boston had moved on. The case was closed. The Strangler was in prison, and Albert DeSalvo, guilty or not, would die with that label. Walpole State Prison, one of the most dangerous prisons in America, a fortress, where Massachusetts kept its most violent criminals, and Albert DeSalvo was its most famous inmate, the Boston Strangler, the name that followed him everywhere. But fame in prison isn't the same as fame on the outside. Out there, he'd been a celebrity. In here, he was a target. He spent most of his time in isolation. For his own protection, the guard said, 23 hours a day in a 6x8 cell, 1 hour in a caged exercise yard. The same routine, day after day, year after year. The media moved on. The book sales dried up. The interviews stopped. And Albert DeSalvo, the man who craved attention more than anything, was forgotten. But something else was happening. DeSalvo was becoming paranoid. He told counselors he felt watched, threatened. At night, he couldn't sleep. Every footstep in the corridor made him freeze. Every voice in the darkness made him panic. But DeSalvo believed it. He wrote letters to anyone who'd listen. His lawyer, his family, the warden, claiming someone wanted him silenced. But who and why? DeSalvo hinted at dark theories, corruption, cover-ups, but no one took him seriously. He was a convicted criminal, a liar, a man who confessed to murders and then recanted. His word meant nothing. November 25th, 1973, a Sunday morning. The guards began their morning count, cell by cell, checking every inmate. When they reached Albert DeSalvo's cell, they found him on the floor, stabbed 16 times, all to the heart. The Boston Strangler was dead. Within hours, the entire prison was on lockdown. Every inmate questioned, every cell searched, looking for the weapon, looking for blood-stained clothing, looking for anything. They found nothing. No witnesses came forward. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. Even though DeSalvo's cell was surrounded by dozens of other inmates, in a place where nothing happens without someone knowing, this murder was invisible. 16 stab wounds, all precise, all to vital organs. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a random prison fight. This was an execution. And in the hours after DeSalvo's death, the prison didn't mourn. Some called it justice. The news spread across the country within hours. For some in Boston, it was closure. The Strangler was finally gone. Detective Donovan watched it all unfold. The man who'd spent years questioning DeSalvo's guilt now faced a different question. Was DeSalvo killed because he was the Strangler? or because he wasn't, the investigation into DeSalvo's murder went nowhere. No arrests, no charges, but the question lingered. In a maximum security prison, with cameras, with guards, with protocols, how does someone get stabbed 16 times without anyone noticing? Unless someone wanted it to happen. 40 years passed. Technology evolved. DNA analysis became standard, and cold case detectives began revisiting the Strangler murders with new tools. They started with Mary Sullivan, the youngest victim, the most brutal murder. In 2013, her body was exhumed. 50 years after her death, her family had fought for this, fought for the truth. DNA samples were taken from evidence preserved at the crime scene. Skin cells, hair follicles, biological material that had sat in evidence lockers for half a century. But to confirm it was DeSalvo, they needed to exhume his body too. Albert DeSalvo had been buried in 1973. 40 years in the ground. DNA samples were extracted from his remains. And then the comparison began. Months of analysis, cross-referencing, verification. July 11th, 2013. The Boston Police Department called a press conference. The results were in. We have a DNA match. Albert DeSalvo's DNA was found on Mary Sullivan. After 50 years, there was finally proof. DeSalvo had killed at least one victim. The confession, at least in part, was true, but only one victim was tested. Mary Sullivan, out of 13. The other victim's evidence is either degraded, lost, or insufficient for DNA testing. Decades of poor storage. Evidence contaminated. Samples lost. Anna Sleezers, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Sophie Clark, and 8 others. No DNA, no definitive proof. Modern forensic experts analyze the remaining cases. Based on behavioral analysis, crime scene signatures, and victimology, we believe there were likely multiple killers operating during the Boston Strangler period. The consensus among experts: at least 2 to 3 different killers. DeSalvo killed Mary Sullivan. That much was certain. But the others? Unknown. George Nassar remains a suspect in several. Other killers, never identified, never caught, likely responsible for more. Boston moved on decades ago. The Strangler became history. A closed chapter. But legally, officially, 12 of the 13 murders remain unsolved. Albert DeSalvo confessed to all 13, was proven guilty of one, and died before he could tell anyone the whole truth. Whatever secrets he had, he took to his grave. Boston today, a thriving city, alive with energy, opportunity, hope. The terror of the early 1960s is barely a memory. The apartments where the murders happened still exist. Different tenants now, different lives. Most people who live there don't even know the history, but 13 women know. Anna Sleezers, a seamstress, a mother, Nina Nichols, a retired physiotherapist, living her golden years in peace. Helen Blake, a grandmother, a woman who survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, only to die in her own home. Ida Erga, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, each with their own dreams, their own futures, their own stories that never got written. Beverly Summons, a graduate student, weeks away from her teaching degree. Evelyn Corbin, Jane Sullivan, Joanne Graff, and Mary Sullivan, just 19. Her whole life ahead of her. 13 women. 13 lives reduced to crime scene photos and case files. Their families spent decades searching for answers. They fought for exhumations, for DNA testing, for investigations that had long gone cold. Some got answers. Most didn't. Every year, on the anniversary of the first murder, a small group gathers to remember, not the killer, not the case, but the women whose names became footnotes in a serial killer's legend. Anna, Nina, Helen, Ida, Jane, Sophie, Patricia, Mary, Beverly, Evelyn, Joanne, and the 2 others whose names are often forgotten. Modest Freeman, 76, and Mary Brown, 69. 13 women, 13 families. 13 stories that deserve better than to be chapters in someone else's infamy. In the decades since DeSalvo's death, experts have returned to the Boston Strangler case again and again. It's become a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, an example of everything that can go wrong when pressure, publicity, and desperation collide. The Boston Strangler case represents a perfect storm of investigative failures, media contamination, prosecutorial pressure, and a suspect desperate for attention. Modern analysis overwhelmingly supports one conclusion: multiple killers. The variance in victim age, location, method, and signature suggests at least 2, possibly 3, separate offenders. DeSalvo's confession contains too many errors, too many inconsistencies. He was a serial confessor, not necessarily a serial killer. George Nassar remains a primary alternate suspect. He had the intelligence, the psychological profile, the opportunity, and no solid alibi for at least 6 of the murders. George Nassar died in 2018, never charged, never convicted, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Experts believe the elderly victims, the first 6 or 7 murders, may have been committed by one killer, the younger victims by another, and Mary Sullivan's murder we know was DeSalvo, but the others may have been opportunistic killers, men who saw the media coverage and realized they could kill and blame it on the Strangler, the perfect cover. Today, the Boston Police Department acknowledges what detectives like Donovan suspected all along. While Albert DeSalvo confessed to 13 murders and was confirmed through DNA evidence to have killed Mary Sullivan, the other cases remain open investigations. 12 cases, still open, still unsolved. 12 families still waiting for closure. So what is the truth about the Boston Strangler? Was Albert DeSalvo a serial killer? Yes, he killed at least one woman, Mary Sullivan. The science proves it. But did he kill all 13? Almost certainly not. Albert DeSalvo was many things: a sexual predator, a liar, a narcissist desperate for fame. He was also a man manipulated by a lawyer who saw dollar signs, a man fed information by a genius killer who may have committed some of the murders himself, and a man who became a legend that was bigger than the truth. The Boston Strangler became a myth, a cultural phenomenon, the subject of movies, books, documentaries, and endless speculation. But beneath the myth were 13 real women, 13 real murders, and a truth that was never fully uncovered. Detective John Donovan retired in 1982. He spent decades haunted by the case, by the questions, by the women. I don't know if we'll ever know the whole truth. Maybe DeSalvo killed some of them. Maybe Nassar killed others. Maybe there were more we never caught. But I know one thing: those women deserve better than what they got. From their killers, from the system, from all of us. Detective Donovan died in 1998, never fully satisfied with the answers. The case remains in the cold case unit, reviewed every few years, hoping for new evidence, new technology, new answers. Perhaps one day, new DNA technology will solve the remaining cases. But with each passing year, the evidence degrades, witnesses die, and the truth slips further away. Today in Boston, life goes on. Women walk alone without fear. Elderly women live independently, without terror. The city has healed. The wounds have scarred over, but the scars remain. 13 names, 13 lives, 13 families forever changed, and one undeniable truth: Albert DeSalvo killed Mary Sullivan. The rest remains a mystery. The Boston Strangler case teaches us something uncomfortable. Sometimes justice is incomplete. Sometimes confessions are false. Sometimes the truth is too complex for a simple answer. Was DeSalvo the Boston Strangler? Yes and no. He was one strangler, but not the Strangler. The legend lives on. The truth remains buried. And 13 women are remembered, not as victims of a famous killer, but as women who lived, who loved, who mattered. Their lives were stolen. Their stories were silenced, but they will never be forgotten. Of the 13 Boston Strangler murders, Only one has been definitively solved through DNA evidence. The other 12 cases remain officially unsolved. Albert DeSalvo died in 1973. George Nassar died in 2018. Neither man was ever tried for the Boston Strangler murders. The truth died with them,